Good morning, and thank you for attending the National Conference, and thanks very much to William Raspberry for comments that went outside the traditionally acceptable narratives, and I think that's part of what we're trying to do here today. We want to think a little bit outside the box, but we're still in a box, and we want to figure out how we got to that box. And before I go into introducing our distinguished panelists, I want to tell you a little bit about what we're about today with respect to this panel. This is Civil Rights Then and Now. I didn't come up with that title. Consider the arc of civil rights over the span of our nation's history and the evolution of civil rights and what's known as the race problem. When the Civil Rights Commission was established in 1957, we didn't have, obviously, a 1964 Civil Rights Act or Title VII, things that we pretty much take for granted right now. There was no 1965 Voting Rights Act. We were only a few years removed from Brown versus Board of Education. Segregation was rampant. I don't think anyone could imagine that we would have, at any time within our lifetimes, and I was around at that time, despite my youthful and virile appearance, that we'd have an African-American president, 2 black secretaries of state, a Latino Supreme Court justice, a couple of black Supreme Court justices, black and Hispanic and Asian captains of industry, doors open for all, wide open in almost every sphere of society. Yet despite those manifest successes, there are considerable disparities that persist. The largest disparities are between possibly whites and Asians on the one hand, and blacks and Hispanics on the other. But the disparities are, I think, incapable of effective enumeration. If you look, for example, in the appendices to Professor Brooks's book on his latest book with respect to race in the age of Obama, you will see some startling disparities on a host of levels, including rates of incarceration, educational attainment, income, and almost every facet of poverty measurement imaginable. So the disparities exist despite more than nominal successes, and the aim of this panel is to try to get at what was the predicate for how we got here today. What are some of the competing civil rights and quote-unquote race problem theories that abound today, and the evolution of the competing models. So without further ado, I'd like to give you an abbreviated introduction to each of our panelists because their accomplishments are too numerous to shoehorn into the limited time that we've got. I'll introduce them all cumulatively, and then they will each speak separately. And then, as Kim Tolhurst told you, we will have time for questions. I may pose a few questions, and we encourage the audience to pose any questions that they may deem fit. I would think that some of the commentary you're going to hear on this panel will bleed over into the subject matter of the next panel dealing with family structure, and frankly will bleed over into virtually every panel and may give us some insight as to what should happen with respect to the Civil Rights Commission, the subject matter of the last panel of the day. Our first speaker is Professor Roy Brooks, Warren Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of San Diego. Professor Brooks is the author of over 100 articles and chapters and 20 books, and his most recent book, Racial Justice in the Age of Obama, tackles the critical question of developing the best post-civil rights model or theory. Prior to joining the University of San Diego faculty, Professor Brooks had a distinguished legal career, beginning with a federal court clerkship, and was in private practice with Cravath, Swain, and Moore. Our second speaker is Roger Clegg, President and General Counsel for the Center of Equal Opportunity, think tank devoted exclusively to promoting colorblind equal opportunity and racial harmony. And before his work at Center for Equal Opportunity, Mr. Clegg held a number of positions with the U.S. Department of Justice, including assistant to the solicitor, where he argued 3 Supreme Court cases. He was the #2 man at the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice and the Environment Division. He also served as vice president and general counsel of the National Legal Center for Public Policy, where he edited and wrote a variety of publications and legal issues of interest to business. And he's a contributing editor to, among other things, National Review Online, and writes frequently for USA Today, The Weekly Standard, Legal Times, Chronicle of Higher Education, and several other periodicals and law journals. And finally, Professor James T. Patterson is the Ford Foundation Professor of History Emeritus at Brown University. He's a graduate of Williams College, and he worked as a reporter for the Hartford Courant prior to attending Harvard University, where he received his PhD in history. His recent publications include Grand Expectations, the United States, 1945 to 1974, for which he received the Bancroft Prize in History. He also wrote America's Struggle Against Poverty in the 20th Century, Brown versus Board of Education, A Civil Rights Milestone and Its Troubled Legacy, and most recently, and he'll be discussing the subject matter of this, Freedom is Not Enough, America's Struggle Over Black Family Life from LBJ to Obama, which provides an historical account of the Moynihan Report. Dr. Tara Hunter of Princeton was to join us today, but she had an emergency to attend to. She regrets that she can't be with us. I will be in charge of enforcing time constraints, so don't take it against me if I look ruthless. I know with the mustache sometimes I do. I'll twirl it from time to time. And with that, I'll start with Professor Brooks. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I have 15 minutes to cover a great deal of material, so I'm going to have at it. I want to begin where I began in my book, Racial Justice in the Age of Obama, and that is with a discussion of my fellow law students at Yale Law School in the early 1970s. And there were not many of us there at the time, but we routinely discussed civil rights issues after dinner in the Yale Law School cafeteria. And some of the students were conservatives, such as Clarence Thomas, who now sits on the Supreme Court, of course, and others were liberal, such as Lonnie Grenier, who's one of the leading critical race theorists today. We sat at a table that we called the Black Table. And in the book, I described the Black Table as follows. The Black Table was not a liberal or conservative table. It was a scholar's table, a truth-seeking table. We disagreed routinely, but almost as often conceded opposing arguments. We did not just have opposing opinions, we also had knowledge and integrity, which enabled us to walk away from the table as friends and remain friends to this day. At the risk of sounding presumptuous, I would like to invoke the Black Table's ambience of civility, probity, and intelligence for today's discussion, and I hope that we can give polite consideration to opposing points of view. That's the only way that I know how to play this game.